Amara Collins sank down onto the edge of the narrow cot in her cramped sub-basement room in Seoul, counting and recounting the 3 crisp, blue 1001 bills in her hand. The 4th time, she prayed the zeros would multiply. But no miracle came. A miracle had never come for her since she landed in Incheon. The visa renewal notice sitting on her small desk gave her exactly 7 days. 7 days to come up with the deposit for a legitimate sponsor, plus the back fees for her late registration. Her hands trembled as she folded the meager bills and stuffed them into the hidden lining of her suitcase. Outside, the monsoon thunder boomed so hard it rattled the single high-set window pane of her basement. Rain lashed the sidewalk above like angry fists. Seoul had never seen a storm this suffocating. Amara stared into her small plastic storage bin. 1 half-empty bag of rice, a jar of bitter kimchi, a single packet of dried seaweed. Her stomach growled, a hollow reminder of the lunch she'd skipped to save for the bus fare, but she ignored it. She'd gotten used to that over the past 6 months of being an invisible ghost in a city of neon. The overhead bulb flickered. She held her breath, praying the power in this illegal Gashiwan wouldn't cut out. The rent for the 50-square-foot space was overdue, too. Everything in her life was overdue. Her phone buzzed, not with a job offer but an automated message from the international hospital in Nigeria reminding her about her brother's mounting surgical debt. It was that buzz, the sound of her failing the only person she had left, that made her finally pick up the phone to call the reclusive billionaire's estate for the high-risk nanny position. The transition from the squalor of her sub-basement room to the cold, clinical opulence of the Kang estate had been jarring, but the silence was what unsettled Amara the most. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a tomb. She stood at the threshold of the master suite, her footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rugs. Across the room, bathed in the pale digital blue of heart rate monitors and air purification systems, lay Kang Min-Joon. To any outsider, the billionaire looked helpless. His chest rose and fell in the slow, heavy rhythm of a man deep in a medication-induced haze. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of the medical equipment Dr. Park had checked only an hour ago. Min-Joon's eyes were closed, his sharp, aristocratic features softened by the shadows. He looked like a king waiting for the end, but beneath the covers his every sense was a jagged wire. He wasn't asleep. He was a predator behind a glass wall, waiting to see if the woman he'd hired to watch his son would choose this moment of vulnerability to betray him. He listened to the soft friction of her uniform, the steady pace of her heart. He waited for the sound of a drawer opening or the click of a camera shutter. Then the silence broke. It wasn't a loud noise, just the faint, rhythmic scritch of metal against a window frame from the nursery wing down the hall. Min-Joon felt the air in the room shift. He expected Amara to panic, to run to the monitors, or perhaps to use the distraction to slip into his private office. Instead, the atmosphere around her turned freezing. The gentle, soft-spoken nanny vanished. In her place was something rhythmic and lethal. Amara didn't scream. She didn't call for the guards who were suspiciously absent from their posts. She moved with a terrifying, weightless grace toward the corner of the room where Hyun-woo's diaper bag sat. Without looking, her hand slid into a hidden seam in the canvas. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. She pulled out a small, matte black tactical blade. Min-Joon's heart hammered against his ribs, though he kept his breathing perfectly stagnant. Through the slit of his eyelashes, he watched her. She stood between his bed and the door, her knees slightly bent, her weight distributed with the muscle memory of a ghost. She wasn't looking at him with greed or pity. She was watching the door with the eyes of a soldier who had seen the face of war and survived it. A shadow crossed the hallway outside. Amara's grip on the knife tightened, her knuckles turning ivory. She looked back at the sleeping man on the bed for a split second, a look of fierce, territorial protection that made Min-Joon's skin crawl. She wasn't an intruder. She was a sentry. And as she stepped into the darkness of the hallway to meet the threat, Min-Joon realized the test had revealed a truth more dangerous than any betrayal. He had hired a wolf to guard his lamb, and the wolf was already hungry. The digital hum of the room was the only thing that filled the heavy silence after the shadow in the hallway vanished. Kang Min-Joon remained motionless, his eyes still closed, but his mind was racing at a speed the heart rate monitors couldn't track. He waited for the sounds of a struggle, for a muffled cry, or the heavy thud of a body. Instead, there was only a soft, metallic click, the sound of the nursery door being locked from the inside, and then a terrifyingly deep stillness. Min-Yi sat up slowly, the silk sheets rustling like dry leaves. He reached for the encrypted tablet hidden beneath his pillow. His fingers, usually steady enough to sign away empires, felt a foreign tremor. He bypassed the security layers and pulled up the night vision feed from the nursery. The screen flickered to life in shades of ghostly green and charcoal. He saw his son, Hyun-woo, fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling in total ignorance of the war at his doorstep. Then, his eyes shifted to the corner. Amara was there. She wasn't cowering. She was positioned in the dead space behind the door, a tactical blind spot that only a professional would recognize. She held the matte black blade in a reverse grip, her thumb locked over the pommel. Her breathing was so controlled it was almost non-existent. When the door handle began to turn from the outside, the intruder Min-Joon had hired to test her, Amara didn't flinch. She tracked the movement with a cold, predatory focus that made Min-Joon's blood run cold. He watched her move as the door was forced open. It wasn't the frantic flailing of a terrified woman. It was a blurred, economized sequence of violence. She used the intruder's momentum against him, a palm strike to the throat followed by a sweep that sent the man crashing silently into the padded wall. In the split second before she could drive the blade into his jugular, she paused. She looked at the man's tactical earpiece, the signature equipment of Min-Joon's own security detail. She didn't kill him. She realized it was a farce. Min-Joon watched through the screen as Amara slowly stood up, her eyes moving toward the hidden camera lens nestled in the smoke detector. She didn't look angry. She looked profoundly, devastatingly disappointed. She tucked the knife back into her waistband, smoothed her apron, and sat down in the rocking chair beside his son's bed. A cold sweat broke across Min-Joon's brow. He had spent his life believing that fear was the only way to reveal a person's true nature. He had expected to see a thief, a spy, or a coward. Instead, he saw a mirror. He saw a soul as scarred and lethal as his own, hidden behind the mask of a gentle immigrant. He was terrified of what she was, but as he watched her gently adjust the blanket over his sleeping son, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. He was fascinated. He had sought a nanny, he had found a soldier, and now the game had changed. He wasn't the only one in the house who was pretending. The sun rose over the estate not with warmth, but with a sterile, blinding light that reflected off the white marble of the breakfast nook. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-pressed coffee and expensive sourdough, yet the atmosphere remained as frigid as the previous night's storm. Kang Min-Joon sat at the head of the table, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked like armor. He was the picture of a reclusive billionaire, his eyes hidden behind a pair of reading glasses as he scanned a tablet that showed nothing but empty market graphs. Amara moved around the table with practiced, invisible efficiency. She served the poached eggs and sliced fruit, her movements soft and deferential, the perfect image of a nanny who knew her place. There was no trace of the woman who had held a tactical blade in a reverse grip only hours before. Her hands were steady as she poured Min-Joon's tea, but the silence between them was a living thing, vibrating with the weight of what they both knew. "The tea is a new blend, Mr. Kang," she said softly, her voice smooth as silk. "I thought it might help with your recovery. Dr. Park mentioned you had a restless night." Min-Joon didn't look up immediately. He let the steam from the cup rise between them, a translucent veil. "Restless is an understatement, Amara," he replied, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He finally lifted his gaze, his hyper-observant eyes searching hers for a flinch, a flicker of guilt, or a shadow of fear. He found none. The security alarm was triggered last night. A glitch in the system, apparently. You didn't seem distressed when the guards checked the wing. Amara met his stare directly. It was a bold move, one that broke the unspoken rules of his household, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that fascinated him. I've lived in places where alarms were constant, sir. You learn to distinguish between a glitch and a threat. My priority was Hyun-woo. He slept through the entire event. Min-Joon set the tablet down with a deliberate click. You speak of places with a certain authority. Your resume mentions a degree in education and work at an NGO in Lagos. It doesn't mention where a schoolteacher learns to remain so composed during a security breach. He was probing, his words like a scalpel seeking a nerve. Amara didn't pull away. She leaned in slightly, a small, sad smile touching her lips. When you grow up where I did, Mr. Kang, composure isn't a choice. It's a survival trait. Just as I imagine it was for a man who built an empire in a city that never stops trying to take it back. It was a direct hit. She had called him out, acknowledging the mask he wore just as he was trying to strip away hers. For a moment, the billionaire investor and the immigrant nanny were gone, replaced by two survivors measuring each other across a battlefield. Survival is a lonely business, Amara, Min-Joon said, his voice dropping an octave. It is, she agreed, picking up the tray, but it's a business I'm very good at. As she turned to leave, Min-Joon watched the way she walked, balanced, alert, and entirely unafraid. He had started this test to see if she was a spy. Now he was beginning to realize she was something far more complicated, his equal. The psychological chess match had begun, and for the first time in his life, the dragon wasn't sure if he was playing white or black. The stillness of the estate was punctured at 3:12 a.m. by a sound that bypassed Min-Joon's security sensors and went straight for his throat, a high-pitched, strangled sob. It was the sound of Hyun-woo drowning in his own sleep. Min-Joon was out of bed before his rational mind could catch up, but as he reached the hallway, he stopped. The nursery door was already ajar, a sliver of warm, amber light spilling onto the cold floor. He pressed his back against the wall, his heart hammering in the silence, and watched through the gap. Hyun-woo was thrashing in his bed, his small face contorted and slick with sweat. His eyes were open but vacant, locked in the grip of a night terror that no amount of money could fix. Amara was already there, but she wasn't shaking him or calling his name in a panic. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her presence a solid, immovable mountain in the dark. "Breathe with me, little star," she whispered, her voice low and resonant, vibrating with a strange, hypnotic authority. She took the boy's hand and pressed it firmly against her own chest, right over her heart. "Box breathing. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. Follow the rhythm." Min-Joon's eyes narrowed as he watched her. Amara began to lead the boy through a cycle of breath that was unnervingly precise. She wasn't just comforting him. She was recalibrating his nervous system. In 2, 3, 4 hold, 2, 3, 4 out, 2, 3, 4. As she spoke, her own body became perfectly still, her shoulders dropping, her face settling into a mask of absolute tactical calm. It was a physiological override, a technique used to maintain cognitive function under extreme duress. Min-Joon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He knew that technique. He had seen it used by the operators in the 707th Special Missions Group, men trained to kill, without letting their heart rate rise above 60 beats per minute. It was a method for the battlefield, designed to purge the fear chemicals from the blood. Hyun-woo's thrashing slowed, his gasps smoothed into long, rhythmic draws of air. The terror receded, replaced by the heavy, natural drowse of safety. He drifted back into a deep sleep, his hand still clutched in Amara. Amara stayed like that for a long time, watching the boy with a look of such profound, aching protection that it momentarily eclipsed her lethal competence. In the shadows of the hallway, Min-Joon's grip on the doorframe tightened. The schoolteacher from Lagos had just used a high-level psychological combat tool to soothe a child's nightmare. She hadn't learned that in an NGO. She had learned that in the fire. He retreated into the darkness of his own room, the silence now louder than ever. He had asked for a test, but he was the one being scrutinized. He didn't just have a soldier in his house. He had a ghost from a world even more violent than his own. And as the sun began to hint at the horizon, Min-Joon realized he wasn't just afraid for his son anymore. He was afraid of how much he wanted to trust the woman who knew exactly how to stop a heart from racing. The heavy, iron-bound doors of Min-Joon's private study remained closed long after the sun had fully claimed the Seoul skyline. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the ozone of high-end servers. Han D-Sik, the estate's head of security and Min-Joon's most trusted shadow, stood like a statue before the desk. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he placed a single, scorched-edge folder onto the mahogany surface. "The NGO in Lagos was a front, boss," D-Sik began, his voice like grinding gravel. "It existed for 3 years, funded by a shell company in the Caymans. They didn't teach literacy. They trained specialists for high-risk extraction in the Niger Delta." Min-Joon flipped open the folder. A grainy, black-and-white surveillance photo fell out. It was Amara, but not the woman who tucked Hyun-woo into bed. In the photo, she was wearing tactical fatigues, her face painted with streaks of charcoal, standing over the wreckage of a jungle convoy. Her eyes were empty, cold, and terrifyingly focused. "She was known as the Viper within the unit," D-Sik continued, his hand hovering near his own weapon as if the photo itself were a threat. "She was their primary medic and their secondary sharpshooter. She vanished 4 years ago after an internal purge. The rumor was she died in a cross-border raid. She didn't just move to Korea for a better life. She moved here because she's a ghost, and ghosts are hard to hit." Min-Joon traced the line of her jaw in the photograph. The hypervigilance, the box breathing, the surgical precision with the blade, it all snapped into a jagged, coherent picture. She wasn't a spy for Lee Sung-ho, but she was a liability. A woman with that kind of history was a magnet for the very violence Min-Joon tried to keep away from his son. "We need to eliminate the risk," D-Sik said, stepping closer. "If the ghost finds out who she is, he won't just use her for leverage. He'll turn her into a weapon against us. I can have it done by midnight. No mess, no trace." Min-Joon looked up, and for the first time, his enforcer saw a flicker of hesitation in the dragon's eyes. He thought of Amara holding Hyun-woo's hand in the dark, her heart beating a rhythm of safety against the boy's palm. "No," Min-Joon said, the word sharp enough to cut. "She hasn't betrayed us. She has protected him in a way your men never could. A viper only strikes when it's cornered, D-Sik. As long as she's in this house, she belongs to me." "You're letting your emotions blind you," the enforcer countered, his voice low with warning. "I'm letting my son have the only person who makes him feel safe," Min-Joon replied, closing the folder. "But keep the surveillance tight. I want to know every breath she takes. If she so much as looks at a secure server, you can have your midnight." As D-Sik left, Min-Joon looked back at the photo. He realized then that they weren't just similar. They were 2 ends of the same blood-stained string. He didn't want to kill her. He wanted to know if a ghost could ever truly find a home. The afternoon sun hung low and heavy over the estate's traditional garden, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured stone paths and the ancient bonsai trees. It was a space designed for meditation, a safe zone where the water from the stone fountain was the only sound permitted to break the silence. Min-Joon walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed in a way that would have fooled anyone but the woman walking 3 paces behind him. Amara followed, her eyes scanning the high stone walls. She felt the shift in the air. The guards who usually paced the perimeter were gone, replaced by an eerie, artificial stillness. This wasn't a stroll, it was a transition to a battlefield. My grandfather built this garden to escape the noise of the world, Min-Joon said, his voice reflecting off the stone. He believed that in nature nothing can wear a mask. A predator is a predator, a prey is prey. There is a brutal honesty in the soil. He stopped at the edge of a koi pond and turned to face her. The warmth of the sun didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, Amara, did the NGOs in Lagos teach you how to scout a perimeter? Did they teach you to identify the 707th box breathing techniques while soothing a child? Amara went still. She didn't flinch, but the softness in her expression evaporated, replaced by the hard, shimmering edge of a blade. She looked at the koi swimming in circles, trapped in their beautiful, expensive pond. I imagine you didn't learn to run a syndicate by reading investment journals, Mr. Kang, she countered, her voice low and steady. Min-Joon took a step closer, entering her personal space. I know about the Niger Delta. I know about the Viper. I know that the woman holding my son's hand at night has enough blood on hers to stain this entire garden red. The silence that followed was deafening. Amara looked up at him, and for the first time she allowed the Viper to look through her eyes. The air between them hummed with the threat of a strike. If you know who I am, then you know I didn't come here to hurt him, she whispered. I came here to bury that woman. I came to Korea to be invisible, to find a place where the only thing I had to protect was a child's peace. And if your past follows you here, Min-Joon pressed, his gaze lethal. If the ghost finds out I have a legendary mercenary in my nursery, you become the very lightning rod that burns this house down. Amara took a step forward, her face inches from his. Then I will do what I was trained to do. I will neutralize the threat before it touches him. But don't mistake my silence for weakness, Mr. Kang. You tested me to see if I was a liar. I'm not. I'm just a survivor who found something worth surviving for. Min-Joon watched the pulse in her neck. He had cornered her, expecting fear or a plea for mercy. Instead, he found a loyalty that was more terrifying than any betrayal. He realized then that the garden wasn't a trap for her. It was the place where he had finally been forced to see her clearly. He turned away, looking back at the house. Keep him safe, Amara. Because if you fail, there is no corner of this earth where a ghost can hide from me. The koi pond remained a mirror between them, reflecting the harsh, uncompromising lines of their faces. Amara exhaled, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 miles and a lifetime of ghosts. The Viper didn't retreat, but the tension in her shoulders shifted from a readiness to kill to a readiness to speak. In the Delta, they don't ask if you want to fight, she began, her voice barely a whisper above the trickling water. The militia came to my village when I was 19. They didn't want my degree or my dreams. They wanted my hands. They saw I could sew a wound and keep a steady gaze under fire, so they turned me into a fixer. I was forced into a war I didn't understand, protecting oil pipelines for men who wouldn't look me in the eye. She turned her gaze to Min-Joon, her eyes raw and stripped of the nanny's mask. I didn't choose the blade, Mr. Kang. It was forced into my palm. Every extraction, every neutralization, it was all for the hope of a passport. I did the things no one should do so I could earn the right to disappear. I came to Seoul because it was the loudest, brightest place I could find. I thought if I moved through the crowds as a ghost, the blood would finally dry. Min-Joon watched her, the predatory stillness of his body slowly ebbing away. He saw the scars not on her skin, but in the way she stood, braced for a world that never stopped hitting back. He thought of his own rise, the way he had stepped over the bodies of rivals to build a fortress for a wife who was now gone and a son who was too fragile for the truth. He had built his throne out of iron and called it success, but looking at Amara, he realized it was just a different kind of survival. I built this house to be a sanctuary, Min-Joon said, his voice unusually soft. But a sanctuary is just a cage with better locks. I spent 30 years becoming a monster so that no one could hurt the people I loved. And in the end, the monster is all that's left. He reached out not to strike or to restrain, but in a gesture that was almost human. He didn't touch her, but his presence settled around her like a shield. You didn't come here to be nobody, Amara. You came here because you recognize the smell of the smoke. We aren't just survivors. We are the architects of our own exile. In that moment, the hierarchy of the estate, the master and the servant, vanished. They were two soldiers standing on the edge of a dying light, realizing they spoke a language no one else in the world understood. Amara looked at him and saw not a billionaire, but a man who was just as tired of fighting as she was. The viper and the dragon had found the one thing neither expected in a world of betrayal: a reflection. The clinical scent of antiseptic usually signaled safety within the estate, but tonight, as Dr. Park Jae-hoon entered the master suite, the air felt chemically sharp, like an edge meant to draw blood. Min-Joon lay beneath the silk sheets, his eyes closed in the familiar rhythm of his lion's sleep. To anyone else, the doctor was a loyal guardian of the family's health, but through the hidden, heat-sensing lens of the security feed, Min-Joon watched the man's hands tremble as he reached for the IV drip. Dr. Park didn't know that the shadow broker's financial collapse had exposed his own secret, a mountain of gambling debts held by the ghost, Lee Sung-ho. The doctor wasn't checking vitals. He was a man paying a debt in installments of poison. He pulled a small, unmarked vial from his breast pocket, the liquid inside a clear, lethal concentrated sedative designed to stop a heart without leaving a trace. Just as the needle pierced the rubber port of the IV bag, a shadow detached itself from the heavy velvet curtains. Amara didn't make a sound until she was inches away from him. She didn't use her knife. She used the predator's silence she had perfected in the Delta. "That isn't the dosage for a restless night, doctor," Amara whispered, her voice like a chilling breeze. Park jumped, nearly dropping the vial. He spun around, his face a mask of sweating, panicked intellect. "Amara, you startled me. Mr. Kang's blood pressure was spiking. I'm adjusting the sedative." "I've seen men die from that adjustment in the jungle," she said, her eyes fixed on the syringe. "It's a neat trick. The heart slows until it simply forgets how to beat. No struggle, no evidence, just a quiet passing for a king who stayed asleep too long." Park's desperation broke through his professional veneer. "You don't understand, Sung-ho. He has my family. He knows everything. If Min-Joon doesn't die tonight, they die tomorrow. And if he dies tonight, you die right now." A low, resonant voice boomed from the bed. Min-Joon sat up, pulling the IV line from his arm with a violent, dismissive tug. He looked at Park not with anger, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a man who had already weighed the doctor's soul and found it wanting. "I trusted you with my son's life, Jae-hoon," Min-Joon said, stepping onto the floor, his charcoal robe billowing like smoke. "That was your only shield. Now it's gone." Amara stepped forward, her hand resting on the small of her back where the blade was hidden. She looked at Min-Joon, a silent question in her eyes. The test was over. The betrayal was manifest, and the ghost was no longer a shadow. He was at their very throat. "Take him to D6, Min-Joon commanded, his eyes turning to the nursery door. "And tell my enforcer to prepare the house. If the ghost thinks he can buy his way into my bedroom, he's about to find out how expensive this house truly is." The silence following Dr. Park's removal lasted only seconds before the estate's heartbeat stopped. With a heavy, mechanical groan, the power grid died. The hum of the air purifiers, the glow of the security monitors, and the soft amber lights of the hallway vanished, plunged into a suffocating, absolute darkness. Outside, the monsoon rain redoubled its assault, the thunder drowning out the sound of the first glass perimeter wall shattering. Min-Joon didn't panic, he simply reached into the darkness. "Amara," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal anchor. "I'm here," she replied, her voice coming from the shadows near the nursery door. She was already moving, her tactical instincts overriding the blindness of the room. "They aren't coming for the safe. They're coming for the wing." Red emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the marble corridors in a rhythmic, strobing crimson. It was a hellish pulse that revealed the first wave of intruders. They weren't common street thugs, they moved in synchronized stacks, wearing matte black tactical gear and thermal goggles. Leading them was a man whose presence felt like a cold draft through a tomb, Lee Sung-ho, the ghost. He didn't hide in the back. He walked through the shattered remains of the grand entrance, his eyes fixed on the upper landing where the heart of the Kang Empire was hidden. Min-Joon, Sung-ho's voice echoed, amplified by the hollow acoustics of the foyer. The doctor failed his final exam. Don't make the same mistake. Give me the boy, and I'll leave enough of your kingdom standing for you to bury your pride. Inside the nursery, Amara had already swept Hyun-woo from his bed. The boy was wide awake, his eyes reflecting the terrifying red pulse of the emergency lights, but he wasn't screaming. He was looking at Amara, sensing the viper beneath the nanny's skin. She pressed him against her chest, her hand covering his mouth not to silence him, but to offer the warmth of her own steady breath. "He's at the stairs," Amara whispered, her ears tracking the rhythmic clack-clack of tactical boots on stone. Min-Joon stood in the doorway, a silenced pistol in his hand, his silhouette jagged against the red light. The businessman was gone. The dragon had returned, but he was no longer fighting for territory or ledgers. He was fighting for the small, shaking life behind him. D6 and the perimeter team are engaged in the courtyard, Min-Joon said, his eyes meeting Amara's in the strobe light darkness. "We are the only ones left in this wing. If they breach this door, the ghost doesn't just take my son, he takes the world." Amara shifted her weight, her free hand finding the hilt of her blade. "Then let him try," she said, her voice a promise of blood. "He thinks he's hunting a lamb. He has no idea he's stepped into a den of wolves." The first flashbang detonated against the nursery door, turning the world white, but as the smoke began to curl into the room, Amara didn't retreat. She stepped into the light, ready to show the ghost why some shadows were meant to stay buried. The white haze of the flashbang was still clearing when Amara moved. She didn't wait for her vision to fully return. She relied on the spatial map burned into her mind. With Hyun-woo tucked against her hip, she vaulted over a low armchair, using it as a shield against the splintering wood of the doorframe. The boy was a silent weight, his small fingers digging into her sweater as she sprinted toward the back of the nursery, where a false bookshelf concealed the entrance to the wing's internal safe room. "Stay down, little star," she hissed, her voice a low vibration against his ear. She hit the biometric scanner, the heavy steel door hissing open just as the first tactical light cut through the smoke behind them. She shoved Hyun-woo inside, but before the door could seal, a gloved hand caught the edge. A massive figure in black fatigues forced his way through the gap, the snout of a suppressed carbine leveling toward her chest. Amara didn't retreat. The viper didn't know how to back away from a strike. She stepped into the attacker's reach, her palm slamming upward into the base of his chin to disrupt his sightline, while her other hand whipped the matte black tactical blade from her waistband. The man was twice her size, but he was fighting a human. Amara was fighting for a soul. She moved with a rhythmic, terrifying fluidity, a blur of shadow against the strobing red emergency lights. She parried the barrel of the gun, the metal clashing against her blade, and drove her shoulder into his sternum. As he stumbled, she didn't hesitate. She executed a precise three-point strike, thigh, kidney, and finally, the soft tissue beneath the helmet's rim. The intruder slumped to the floor, the heavy thud of his body muffled by the thick carpet. Amara stood over him, her breathing shallow but perfectly controlled, the blade in her hand now wet and dark. She looked down at the blood on her fingers, then at the wide, silent eyes of Hyun-woo watching from the safety of the reinforced room. The nanny was dead. The protector was all that remained. "Amara," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't look away from the door, her body coiled like a spring, ready for the next shadow to breach the threshold. "Don't look at the floor, Hyun-woo," she said, her voice regaining that hypnotic, box-breathing calm even as the scent of iron filled the small space. "Look at me. You are safe. I promised your father, and I never break a contract." She hit the internal lock, the 6-inch steel bolts grinding into place with a sound of finality. She was cornered, trapped in a box with a dead man and a terrified child, but as the ghost's men began to hammer on the exterior plating, Amara felt a cold, familiar clarity. She had proven her loyalty in the only currency the Kang Empire understood. Now, she just had to survive long enough to spend it. The safe room door hissed open, but Amara didn't emerge as a victim. She stepped out as a Gale. Min-Joon was waiting in the hallway, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He held a high-caliber handgun with the steady, indifferent grip of a man who had seen empires rise and fall on the pull of a trigger. When his eyes met Amara's, seeing the crimson spray across her apron and the lethal stillness in her gaze, he didn't look away. He nodded. It was the only contract they needed. "Hyunwoo is secure," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum over the distant chatter of gunfire. "Then let's finish this," Min-Joon replied. They moved through the darkened mansion like a single, multi-headed predator. Min-Joon took the high angles, his shots rhythmic and precise, clearing the corridors with surgical efficiency. Amara stayed low, a blur of motion in the red strobe light. When a pair of Sung-Ho's mercenaries breached the landing, she didn't wait for a clear shot. She closed the distance in 3 explosive strides, her blade finding the gaps in their armor before they could level their sights. She was the shadow to his fire, the silent edge to his thunder. At the base of the grand staircase they were nearly overrun. A flashbang skittered across the marble, but before it could detonate, a heavy tactical shield slammed into the floor in front of them. Han D-Sik, the enforcer who had spent weeks calling for Amara's head, stood between them and the blast. The explosion rocked the foyer, but the line held. D-Sik turned, his face a mask of soot and blood. He looked at Min-Joon, then shifted his gaze to Amara. He saw her holding the line, her blade ready, her eyes protecting the path to the nursery even as she stood in the kill zone. There was no more suspicion, no more talk of the Viper. He saw a soldier who had bled for his master's blood. D-Sik reached into his belt and tossed a spare high-capacity magazine to Min-Joon, then looked at Amara. "The west exit is blocked," he grunted, his voice a sign of grim respect. "We push through the center. You take the left flank, Viper. I'll take the right. The boss stays in the middle." "Understood," Amara said, her voice steady. In the heart of the chaos, the 3 of them became an unbreakable wall. The Mafia boss, the enforcer, and the Nanny, a trinity forged in the dark, moving with a synchronized lethality that turned the ghost's invasion into a slaughter. For the first time, Min-Joon felt the weight of his empire shifting. He wasn't just fighting with employees anymore. He was fighting with a family of monsters who had finally found something worth more than fear. The violent crescendo of the night broke against the dawn like a fevered dream. Lee Sung-Ho, the man they called the Ghost, did not meet his end with a grand speech or a final stand. He was found in the wreckage of the grand foyer, pinned by the very enforcer he had underestimated and silenced by the dragon he thought had grown soft. With the head of the rival syndicate neutralized, the remaining invaders melted into the rainy darkness of the Seoul outskirts, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with the weight of change. In the weeks that followed, the Kang estate underwent a transformation that no ledger could capture. The high-caliber munitions and tactical gear were cleared out of the hidden compartments, replaced by the mundane, beautiful clutter of a childhood reclaimed. Min-Joon did not hold a victory gala. Instead, he systematically dismantled the iron scaffolding of his underground empire. He sold the shipping routes, closed the offshore war chests, and transitioned the remains of the syndicate into a legitimate logistics titan. He had realized that the only way to truly protect his son was to step out of the shadows that invited the light of fire. The final transition occurred on a warm spring evening, as the scent of cherry blossoms drifted through the open windows of the dining room. There were no armed guards at the doors, and the red emergency strobes had been replaced by the soft, golden glow of paper lanterns. Madame Seo and Han Seok-woo sat at the table, the enforcer now dressed in a simple knit sweater, his hands resting peacefully near his plate. At the center of the table sat Hyun-woo, his laughter ringing out, a clear, joyous sound that was no longer haunted by nightmares. Amara entered the room, but she was not wearing the crisp white apron of a nanny or the tactical vest of a mercenary. She wore a vibrant silk dress that caught the light, her movements fluid and relaxed. As she took her seat at the right hand of Min-Joon, she didn't serve the food. She waited for the plates to be passed. Min-Joon reached across the table, his hand finding hers. His palms were no longer slick with the cold sweat of paranoia, and hers were no longer curled into fists. They were two ghosts who had decided to become flesh and blood again. "To the future," Min-Joon said, raising a glass of tea. "To the home," Amara replied, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the room. The dragon had retired and the viper had found her peace. As the sun set over the city, casting long, peaceful shadows across the garden, the house was finally more than a fortress. It was a home. The test was over, the past was buried, and for the first time in his life, Min-Joon didn't have to pretend to sleep. He was finally awake and he was finally safe.